Yeah, maybe we could kind of start at the where we are now and work backwards in some ways. But as I was mentioning earlier, um, one of the ways to characterize what we do and have always done, even though the sort of some of the details have changed, sort of a tagline way of characterizing our business that you might say to a customer would be, hey, you've made the right choice technically to go with Linux. There's no question about that. We obviously see that decision has been in the market many times. Now what you need to do is complement that great technical decision with the right business decision. In other words, how are we going to incorporate Linux into our business? And of course there we think the right way to do that, so it's our business, the right way to do that is by using a partner such as MontaVista to be the core Linux supplier. So congratulations on a great technical decision using Linux. Take it to the next step, make the right business decision, and use MontaVista. And that's been the foundation of what we've done all along. Now what's happened is the details of what you need to do that have changed. So if we wind back 10 years to when we started, 10 years ago, a little bit over now, when we started the company, it's kind of fun to reminisce in the sense of most folks thought we were crazy, which is an interesting spot to be in. But certainly Wind River and others were very actively dismissing the idea that you could use something such as Linux in an embedded system. And of course we knew better, and we proved that very quickly. But at the time, it was such an outlier that it was yet another OS that was possible to use in embedded systems, along with the 52 bazillion other RTOSs and so on that people use. In other words, when we started, it was a highly fragmented, and had always been a highly fragmented OS space for embedded systems. And what we were doing is bringing Linux in as yet another alternative. Now, we thought it was the right long-term alternative, and obviously we've been proven right, but just remember that 10 years ago it was in this sea of other RTOSs. And in that sense, the only thing MontaVista could do was to do for Linux what others were doing for proprietary RTOSs, which is to build one. In other words, start with the basic sources, and at that point, typically kernel.org. If there were ports to other processors, they were often way out of date and quite buggy. But nevertheless, we were the initial starting point. We had to produce the core distributions, do the core hardware support, and put together a distribution that could be used in embedded systems. And in some sense, that model, although starting with open source and Linux technology, the internal model, the idea of specifying what the features would be, selecting the rev of Linux that you were going to use, trying to pick the best one at the time, which was a challenge early on. But many other aspects of the business were precisely the same as what you did in the RTOS world. And you defined the universe, and it was a universe that was in parallel with the semiconductor makers. They would supply the silicon. The RTOS makers, and now including MontaVista with Linux, would specify on their own and at their own judgment which chips they were going to support, what the feature load would be like, and so on. And that's a very successful model, given the circumstances at the time and given the relative lack of participation by the semiconductor makers, for example. And that worked like a charm. And in fact, that's what pioneered and powered the first, 5 or 6 years of MontaVista growth. We led the charge, and that sort of, in a sense, proprietary model, but using Linux as the core technology, served us extremely well. But long around 2006, 2007, somewhere in there, a funny thing happened, and that is that Linux won. We didn't think it was a funny thing. We thought we were pouring gas on that fire. But it became very clear through market adaptation studies and so on, in other words, what OS are people using in their embedded systems, that's long around 2005, 2006 or so, Linux was in the 30 to 40% range. Now it's well over 50% of new design starts on 32 or 64-bit embedded processors are using Linux. The first time ever there's been a clear winner and a clear standard in the embedded systems OS market, and it started to happen on the order of 3 or 4 years ago. That in turn had a tremendous sort of galvanizing effect on the market for sure, but also on the behavior of our semiconductor friends. Whereas before it was impossible for them to figure out what OS to put onto their silicon. They would maybe fund VxWorks, which is, even though a small percentage, was still the most likely RTOS, but a very small percentage of the overall market. But now it was very clear that if they were going to spend any money at all, they would spend it on Linux. And rightfully so. And what they needed to do, and what they thought they needed to do, was to make sure that the Linux implementation on their chip made full use of the hardware acceleration and or features that their particular chip might have. It's intrinsically in their business to make sure that Linux is, nicely supported on the chip and sort of features, all the hardware capabilities that they have. So what happened then is that the core starting point for a company who's commercialized Linux company such as MontaVista, where to start from changed dramatically from 10 years ago, where you had to start kind of back at the atomic level, because we had to do the core bring up and so on. The starting point has dramatically shifted over the last 3 or 4 years, and it's really culminated in the last couple of years, to where you don't want to be and cannot be going back to elemental bits for Linux. You can't independently decide what parts of the hardware you're going to support. You can't independently decide what rev of Linux you're going to use without extraordinarily difficult rework and tremendous investment in time and money. In other words, you can't rationally be out of sync with the people that are doing the core development of the software, and that's the semiconductor makers. That's a huge shift in the kind of dynamics of this market. It says that any independent third-party Linux provider has to adapt their model to be consistent with and leverage the fundamental work that the semiconductor guys make, and that you can't have, or I think it's very unproductive to have, and it doesn't serve the customers well, to have this sort of proprietary RTOS model of your own world, your own private definition, out of sync with the primary silicon producers. So that dynamic, which was fueled by us in the sense of helping push Linux along to being the dominating OS, has dramatically changed the dynamics of what a company such as MontaVista does in its kind of internals and how we manage the core development of our distribution. And all it says is that with the same efforts that we originally had to apply to kind of doing elemental work, we can take that same amount of engineering resource and leverage on top of the fine work that our semiconductor friends have done to bring Linux up on their silicon. And it says, therefore, that the additional features and capabilities, additional testing, whatever that we think is useful to enhance our distribution to make it quicker for our customers to use Linux, that's where we apply those resources. So it's just a shift in focus. But the ultimate end is still to have our customers develop their devices quicker, get to market faster, lower cost, higher quality, the usual things that we've always been associated with. I think the net effect that, with that background in mind, then I think one can understand why something such as MontaVista Linux 6 needed to be done. And MontaVista 6 is it's the first Linux distribution for embedded systems, I think anyway, that's been produced in the post-victory phase, so to speak. After Linux has won, it's sort of MontaVista Rev 2 in the sense of, okay, so now you've won, you've really got to examine everything you do in terms of engineering and product development and even product specification to kind of exist now in this, the winning side of the business. And I think another aspect of kind of being in this post-victory stage is the ascendancy in general, not only of Linux, but open source technology for the development of devices of all kinds. And if in the old model it was kind of a closed universe, as the RTOS business is, the polar opposite almost is the open model as exemplified by open source. And it's not that it's uniformly done, but just the notion of how open source works, from starting with Linux, but many other middleware application and tool pieces. There's a general way in which the open source processes work, And I think another matter or part of MontaVista 6 is that the way it's delivered and the way it sort of installs itself in a general sense into the customer's development environment is absolutely consistent with the way in which open source projects like to package themselves and like to use source as the foundation of how the technology is developed. And so the kind of underpinnings of MontaVista 6 on the technical side for Linux is being consistent with the semiconductor distributions, being a superset of the semiconductor distributions. On the kind of open source side, it's being very consistent with the way in which sources are used, how they're managed, the processes involved in utilizing open source, how they're packaged, whether it's RPM or other kind of package mechanisms. But it's basically to be very transparent in the customer's engineering environment and to be very friendly with the way in which other open source pieces will be combined to produce the final product, the software product that the customer is building. And that's a very, you got to be a real software engineer and understand software process, as we see in some of the video from Joe Green. But if you're a practicing engineer, how our stuff fits into your environment and how it integrates with other open source pieces that you might be using, you'll find dramatically different and dramatically and smoothly integrated with the open source processes that we draw upon. And I think it's a more subtle part of MontaVista 6 in some ways. It's called the integration platform, but it's a real recognition of the pervasive role that open source is playing and making sure that we don't thwart that pervasive role, but rather grease the skids and otherwise fit into a very dominating part of the engineering efforts that our customers, the kind of characteristics of the engineering processes that our customers have to use to put together their products. But I think the way I'd like to characterize the overall impact that we'd like to have on this is it's one of amplification with our customers as opposed to fighting. You can argue it at some level if a very common means of using Linux is do it yourself. And I fall into this all the time, so I have to be careful. But if you're a supplier, a very common then position is to sort of argue with the customer about whether they should be doing things themselves. And it's an interesting spot to be in. But I thought of a way of characterizing this. I think that's complementary to our engineering customers, and yet actually does frame the right question to be asking. And I think if we can have our customers ask this question, and it's why we are successful, it's a positive answer. And the way it goes is this, just to remind everybody that the decision to use Linux in an embedded device is certainly, in almost all cases now, it's pretty obvious, the right decision. Technically, it's a good platform to be basing your application on. And I think we've proven that along with our customers for years now. What I want everybody to ask is, or to think about is, okay, if that's the right technical decision, and a good one, what's the right business decision to accompany that? In other words, now that I've technically decided to use Linux, let's go understand the business implications of using Linux and whether we should do things ourselves or have a supplier, and what's the best for our business to amplify the technical decision that we've already made. And I think if people approach it that way, and with our help, they can see that clearly the right technical decision is to have chosen Linux, and we think, and we can demonstrate very clearly, that the right business decision is to choose